Okay, so we're joined here with Amy Dobson to talk about algorithmic hotness. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Can you tell us a little bit, if students want to kind of check out Amy's work, there'll be more links here. I've got some updated ones to go in as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your research so far and what you're up to at the moment?
Yes, I coordinate our programs in digital and social media at Curtin on Wajak Buja. And I am currently doing some research with Nicholas Carra and a big team there that Dan Angus is also on, who I believe you've also heard from. And that was on alcohol promotion as it comes into young people's feeds. So we're currently publishing out of our qualitative interviews with young people. I'm also have been working with Julia Coffey at Newcastle on facial editing software and young people's gendered
Yep.
experiences of that as it
We've done a whole week
pertains
on that. Yeah.
to body image.
Yeah.
And we're working on a book based on that at the moment.
Yeah.
And I've also been doing some research with a team in New Zealand around young people's understanding of sexual harassment media, so that comes into their feeds and that they comment about, or in the post Me Too era.
Yep. Excellent. So we're talking specifically today about some previous research you did, again with Nick and others, around promotion, brands, drinking, and social media. I think we've already kind of gone over in the course some of the aspects of the method and the way that it was done.
Mhm.
So we don't need to go into that in too much detail here. I don't think. I'm just putting that up
Mhm.
here to flag that back to the students, and it's in the reading. So yeah,
Mm.
can you tell us a little bit, generally about what your take is on here in terms of the algorithmic hotness idea, and just to kind of
Yeah.
introduce the topic.
So this was a study that Nick done, but he brought me on board, and it was the start of a very productive collaboration because he was trying to figure out the gender imbalance in the data that he was getting back. So when you're collecting images of young people's, either from their feeds or what they're posting to feeds, and in that kind of messy, what we were understanding 10 years ago is that messy space of between self-produced content and advertising content, and promo people, promo girls, that we would now call influencers, but we were sort of using a whole range of different terms: influencers, promo girls, cultural intermediaries.
Yeah.
And what he noted was, in interviewing and in looking through this content, there was such a big gender imbalance. And so, what the two of us together were trying to do in this paper and in analysing the data was explain that a bit, explain why female bodies are the ones that get constantly imaged in advertising as well as on young people's own feeds. And so we were calling that algorithmic hotness in this particular paper, but it ties into this whole much longer set of gendered relations around what it means to image yourself and to be represented in media.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
And that's through the notion of the male gaze, right?
Um, yeah, through the notion of the male gaze, and part that is part of what we were trying to explain as how that becomes encoded into computer
Yeah.
systems,
The male
right?
gaze is kind of coded into these kind of recognition systems.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that it's no, the online world is no different to the club, where women's bodies are the ones, and a particular kind of women's body,
Yeah.
not just any woman's body, is the one that they want to get through the door to attract, a heterosexual crowd. And again, that's no different online, and how that shows up in advertising, but it also shows up in young people's feeds, is the imaging of hot
Yeah.
feminine bodies.
Yeah. Like this.
Um, yeah, but it's not just the male gaze. I suppose what a lot of my work focuses on is post-feminist media cultures, and then the ways in which certain types of youthful femininity have become, not just accepted, but almost kind of a pressure on young women to represent themselves in a certain way. And
Yep.
alcohol plays a part in that.
Yep. 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 So does this relate to kind of work around feminist luminosities and that kind of thing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. I think, I'm just looking at this slide, hot promos, yeah, simply position their bodies in clubs and attract freshers and frothers.
Yep.
And so what we were trying to get at there was the sort of class distinctions that come into how young women were describing this work themselves, the promo girls, cultural intermediaries. Some of, they tried to make distinctions whereby, they were saying, oh, the younger ones or the less sophisticated ones just stand in the club looking hot, whereas some of us try to put skill into the work, right? So there
Yep.
was sort of these class distinctions coming into how they described and made it acceptable to themselves and to us as the interviewers,
Yep.
the saying it's not just about my body. I also put creativity into it. I also put some thought into how I take these images, how I craft these posts, and blah blah blah.
Yep.
Um, yeah,
So
but
the right kind of work relating to Bev Skeggs' work about respectability that I'm really familiar with, and yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and kind of the way that she talks about value. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So we were drawing on that, and I think, yeah, I suppose the other point that is still really important today, and we've seen this in our later study, it really explains again what the difference. So we've recently sort of done an update of this, and a larger project where we talk to participants in Perth, Brisbane, and Melbourne about what's coming into their feeds. We ask them to screenshot alcohol ads.
Hmm.
And again, we see kind of gender distinctions in the kinds of bodies that are showing up in alcohol ads, right? As well as in their own feeds.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, what was really interesting about that was that, the we in a recent paper we discussed sort of three groups of sort of the femme girls that are brunching and going out to what's it called, bottomless
Bottomless lunch.
brunches
Yeah.
and cocktails and all this kind of stuff. Then there's the group of queer participants whose alcohol ads and their own feeds is very tied into queer cultures.
Hmm.
And then there's the blokes. And we had a pretty small minority of, kind of more cis male participants. And there was the most discrepancy with them between what their own feeds and images looked like and the promotional, the undercurrent
Yep.
promotional, the memes and that kind of content, and then the paid obvious retail ads, right? Whereas for the girls and the queers, that's all visually coherent,
Right.
right? And what we're arguing is that this sexual subjectivity, the notion of hotness, class, being as a post-feminist subject, that it's become pretty normalized to celebrate drinking for girls, right?
Yep.
That's a stylistic, okay, celebratory thing. So we see a lot of bodies, a lot of female bodies in those traditional ads, and then in cocktail memes,
Yep.
and then in the girls' own images themselves. Those all look alike,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And that's what we're arguing is because that's pretty brand safe to kind of promote alcohol as part of hotness, empowerment,
Yep.
and as long as, and I would say the class thing comes into that in an interesting way too. We've got, a lot of what we're seeing in that was kind of girls who would have a sophisticated side and a messy side, and they really liked when the algorithm got both of those things
Okay.
together.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
They were
right.
like, yeah, it's got me, it's pegged me, it understands all of my different sides, my messy side and my sophisticated side.
Yep. Yep.
Whereas the guys, I can talk about more, but they
Yep.
weren't, it was a different story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. The guys were a bit more consistent, was in one kind of aesthetic or image.
Well, their paid ads for say, let's say Whiskey and Dan Murphy's were
Yeah.
boring ads, okay?
Yeah.
Not, and they would go, yeah, doesn't resonate. I scroll past, what's interesting about this?
Yeah. Right.
But then their memes around alcohol were pretty
Yeah.
toxic.
Right. Okay.
And they didn't, and when I say pretty toxic, I mean jokes about misogyny, jokes about violence against women,
Yeah.
about homophobia, but all just jokey.
Yep.
And they didn't see they didn't see any connection, but there were visual connections where, because that stuff's not brand safe. And that's what they said to us. Oh, I guess this isn't really brand safe. The brands can't incorporate those jokes in their advertising. We're like, yeah, you're making, but there are subtle hints if you know, and you're seeing that in your feed next to a Dan Murphy's ad,
Yep.
you make the link, is what we're arguing.
Yep. Yep. That
Do you
makes
know what I
sense.
mean? So there are ways of encoding gender much more subtly
Yep.
for a masculine subjectivity
Yep.
so that the retail brands can remain brand safe while the memes still speak to some really toxic norms around what it means to be a male subject.
Yep. Yep. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah. Be interesting being able to read that when it comes out. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, so in the previous study too, there was like temporality is important. We don't need to touch upon this too much, but like particularly images that were drawn out were kind of late night kind of stuff, weren't they, to kind of celebrate that kind of, conviviality and all that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah.
Liking photos with no inhibition is an interesting kind of quote there.
Yes. So temporality and location, I think, were something that were really important and that played out in 2016 in a very different way than that's playing out now.
Yep.
So and that was part of what we were trying to capture, and that you can only capture when you're asking young people to screenshot in the moment or in the vicinity of the club,
Yep.
right? Um, and that was what was happening, was that a lot of this promotional material was reliant on bodies being in a certain space at a certain time that would then, the algorithm could encode and could rely on that sort of
Yep.
looseness, as they say, for liking, for sharing, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And that still happens, but it wasn't as big a factor in our more recent work as we thought it would be.
Okay.
Like post-COVID, I think, yeah, there's much more variance in that nightlife scene and in how young people are engaging with it.
Yep.
And there was some interesting sort of spikes or issues with temporality where you'd see somebody getting some really problematic ads at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then sometimes also those, cues to go and seek help with their drinking,
Yeah. Right.
following on from each other.
Yep.
But yeah,
Yeah.
the time and the place aspect of it is a lot messier, I would say,
Yeah.
today than it was when we did this study.
Yeah, yeah, and no doubt that automation and kind of the kind of move from kind of temporal feeds to kind of algorithmic feeds would be making a big difference in that as well, I imagine. Yeah, yeah,
Well, they're all algorithmic feeds. I think the important distinction there is maybe and what Nick and Dan are trying to sort of track and explain a bit better is the difference from sort of the different ways of targeting have switched to more tuning in the moment type
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah. Those machines are much more, attuned to being able to kind of do something for what you're doing right now rather than just you as a person generally. It's you as a person in this moment. They kind of
Yeah.
trying to attribute towards that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and so. Yeah, can we talk a bit more broadly here about like, this kind of idea of women's work in algorithmic media cultures, producing body heat?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you talk a bit about that for us, please?
So I think, and this is maybe an obvious point, but one that sort of doesn't get is made enough or is tricky to make, is that with when we're talking about just norms around femininity and masculinity, um, as we've talked about, the male gaze, women's bodies in media and screen is a part of our cultural norms going back thousands of years in a way that has a different set of connotations for the male body, right?
Yep.
But then there's also with the move to digital and social media and sort of, there was big questions that were arising when I first started researching this, that, oh my God, now women have the tools to represent themselves, right? And we thought that might potentially be a kind of empowering thing or a way of changing stereotypes and thinking about your own self-representation. And of course it is and it can be, but it hasn't played out in the way that we thought it might be a challenge to representational stereotypes of women.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the other thing that we have to now understand is that the norms of self-imaging are very gendered.
Mm.
And I've spoken to parents about this. I've spoken to teens about this, about it's not really, it's normal for girls to take selfies and they might get shit for it and they might get called narcissists, but it's a accepted part of their femininity
Yep.
to self-image a lot and to take photos with their friends. And if you don't do that, you're not participating in certain aspects of normal, legible feminine social life.
Yep.
And there's a whole different set of connotations around self-imaging for men and for young men.
Mm.
And, it's a feminized act. The selfie is a feminized act. The posting and sharing a lot of self-images is feminized. So guys don't tend to do that as much. And parents notice this as well, right?
Yep.
And that all has implications in our algorithmic media systems for training data and for coding data,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so this is what we were starting to get at back then that is like, probably 10 times more important now, is algorithmic social media systems are geared towards recognizing and reproducing flows of content that stimulate attention, okay, blah, blah, blah. And that means that women are doing valuable labor in imaging themselves all the time and then encoding that data by sharing it, by liking it, by tagging people in it. All of that is very valuable work in these systems and has trained our Gen AI systems today.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of, yeah, again, it speaks to how value was created and that kind of thing. Yeah. And in the talk with Nick, we talk about that through, participatory labor and effective labor and how that is definitely what.
And it helps explain why we see women quite and queers quite well targeted, coherently targeted in a way that really resonates with them and that makes them feel like the algorithm sees me.
Yep.
And that was a little bit different for blokes.
Yep. Right. Yeah. So I suppose the prominence of women's bodies um, trains the algorithms in a way that kind of creates that, right? It's kind of almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it means that, as subjects, they're more likely, the individual human is more likely to feel seen and recognized by
Yeah.
the algorithm and can be, for better or worse, sold to more effectively. Because, being visible and being seen is also to be surveilled. And that's the thing. And
Yeah.
that's another important point that we try to make in this, paper is, there's some ways in which in the past visibility has been thought of as a form of power, but we're suggesting, and it has been suggested in feminist media studies as well, that there's a power in remaining less visible too.
Mm.
There's a
Mm.
power in being less up for surveillance, less of
Yep.
your body being seen.
Yep.
And there's certainly a power that we can start to note in the way that, gender was being, toxic norms of masculinity were being encoded into alcohol-related memes without being branded by any attributable company.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's really important. It makes a lot of sense that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So Amy, can you kind of maybe sum up what's important here? We've talked about the research from 10 years ago, and you've touched upon the stuff you're writing up now that, I would have set if we could get it, but we've kind of, it's good to hear about that. So you can tell us a little bit what's important now, and then where you think this stuff is going to be going in the next few years.
Well, I guess, yeah, that follows on from what I was just saying. We are
Mm.
entering a situation where, yeah, to be seen by an algorithm is also to be surveilled, and it's not so much about being sold to as your behavior being predicted, right?
Yep.
And it is really important that that's happening in gendered ways and in ways that sexuality has a role in sexed and gendered ways.
Hmm.
And I think, it's taken us forever to try and figure out what the point of, what the significance was to those patterns we were seeing in the data, right? Back then and also now. Like, why does it matter that blokes have less visually coherent feeds in
Mm.
terms of their own and promotional cultures than girls?
Yeah.
Um, but what we've finally been able to clarify, what I've finally been able to clarify for myself, is that its logics of gender violence are actually being quite subtly encoded into these systems.
Yeah.
Because, as I said, there is that link between what is brand safe and targeted at a largely masculine demographic.
Hmm.
Um, and that's the thing. I should say as well, this isn't about boys and girls, women and men. It's it's about proxies of gender via computer systems. So
Yeah.
you could be you could be a female subject, but if you've got all the right sort of, if the computer understands you in a certain way, then it will encode you.
Mm.
Um, so people aren't being micro-targeted anymore, but gendered subjects are still being created by these systems, and actual discourses of violence and misogyny are still being encoded into these systems in ever subtler ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's a really interesting place to stop. Yeah. Yeah. That's important. Yeah. 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 Okay. So, thanks so much for your time, Amy. I really appreciate it.
No worries.
Thanks.